reading Genesis 26, verses 1 through 16. There was another famine in the land, in addition to the one that had occurred in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, at Gerar. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land that I tell you about. Stay in this land as an alien, and I will be with you and bless you. For I will give all these lands to you and your offspring, and I will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring." Because Abraham listened to me and kept my mandate, my commands, my statutes, and my instructions, so Isaac settled in Gerar. When the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," for he was afraid to say my wife, thinking, "The men of the place will kill me on account of Rebekah, for she is a beautiful woman." When Isaac had been there for some time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from the window and was surprised to see Isaac caressing his wife, Rebekah. Abimelech sent for Isaac and said, "So she is really your wife. How could you say she is my sister?" Isaac answered him, "Because I thought I might die on account of her." Then Abimelech said, "What have you done to us? One of the people could easily have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us." So Abimelech warned all the people, "Whoever harms this man or his wife will certainly be put to death." Isaac sowed seed in that land, and in that year he reaped 100 times what was sown. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and kept getting richer until he was very wealthy. He had flocks of sheep, herds of cattle, and many slaves, and the Philistines were envious of him. Philistines stopped up all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of his father Abraham, filling them with dirt. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Leave us, for you are much too powerful for us."
So this summer, my wife and kiddos and I took a trip with my side of the family to Hilton Head Beach. Now, growing up, we were never beach people, so I'm still learning why people are fascinated with the beach and think it's relaxing. Now, I think the older my kids get and the less I'm worried about them, I'm slowly starting to see the appeal. But when I really enjoy the beach is the evenings. Now, some people like the mornings as well, but I don't get up early if I don't have to. So I'm like an evening beach guy because it's not as hot, first of all. And secondly, and mainly, there's just way less people, right? So it's beautiful when you walk out and there's nobody. But during the middle of the day, everyone's scrambling to find the best spots. There's, beach tents and umbrellas and just people everywhere. And you can try to pretend that you're the only one there, put your headphones in, but you're just not. Like, there's people everywhere. I don't know if you've seen like the Instagram reels where it's like Instagram versus reality. And you see this ad for this beautiful like island beach. And then people go there and show you how it really is. And it's just absolutely crowded. There's trash everywhere, people everywhere. I just don't like being crowded. I'll be at lunch with Kevin, and it's just the two of us, and we're at a 4-top table, and I'm still like kicking the chair out of the way because I just don't want it near me. I don't like being crowded. We took our kids for end of year, the Wild Water Park, whatever it's called, in Coleman recently. And our favorite time was the last hour before close because nobody's there. We're just going up and down the slides, just walking up the stairs. It was beautiful. And I think the main reason, if I'm honest, I have to admit, it's probably not good. The reason I don't like crowds is because I often live with a scarcity mindset. The more people that are at this Jalen Milroe football camp that was ridiculous, the less reps we get, right? I mean, it stills for me. The more people that are at this water park, the longer I have to wait in line. And in the short term, the reality is that can often be true, right? In a world where there is not always a balance of supply and demand, there are limited resources. There's only so many tickets to the Eras Tour dates or Benson Boone at the Orion. And at some point, they're going to be sold out, right? I know, I almost mentioned y'all, but I don't want you to think I was making, is that what you wanted? Did you want me to? No, okay. Okay, sorry. I almost made a joke, but I was like, I don't want you to think I'm demeaning them, so. And I did anyway, so it's I was going to say, and then say. So there is that reality, but what would it be like to zoom out, see the bigger picture, and live with an abundance mindset? What would it be like to really believe that there was a God who actually owned the cattle on 1,000 hills, as the old saying puts it? To actually have a belief system that didn't mean the success of one person meant that someone else had to miss out. To genuinely be grateful when others get to experience a joy that we've yet to receive. And really believe that we truly do have everything we need. Is that actually possible to live that way? And what would a community of people look like who lived in light of that? And these are some of the questions that I want to invite you to explore with me during our time together this morning. So as we've already said, and you can see, we're continuing through Genesis today and covering all of chapter 26. You heard the first 16 verses read, which kind of set up the story. I'm going to summarize some of the others and we'll kind of go through it. This chapter, we get kind of a small condensed glimpse into the life of Isaac. If you've been with us, you remember that recently we've seen the death of a generation with Sarah and Abraham passing off the scene. And last week we got to see the birth of their two grandsons, Jacob and Esau. And so that's going to continue in chapter 27. But right here to kind of wrap up a lot of Isaac's story, we get a summary of his chapter. It's really the only chapter where he's kind of highlighted as the main character. And so the story centers around him here. Now, before we jump fully into the story, I want to make a couple observations that might help us get into the text. So I really believe that in many ways, first of all, this story is meant to serve as a bit of a summary and a snapshot of where we've been so far. We kind of had creation to Abraham and now Abraham to Jacob. And this story kind of summarizes a lot of the cycles and themes that we've already seen emerge. And I think you'll see that as we go along. Another thing it's important to keep in the back of our minds in this text is to remind us of the exilic nature of the founding fathers and mothers of Israel's story. They are often called exiles or foreigners, or the way the text says it here is aliens, right? That's just the idea of immigrants or foreigners. And this is a theme that has already been established and will continue throughout the story arc of the whole Bible all the way into the New Testament. And so kind of keep that lens of exiles in the back of your mind as we work throughout this story. And the last thing to remember that we remind all of us probably every week is that even though we're talking about Isaac as kind of the central role, the main character of Genesis is God. And so ultimately, this text is meant to teach us something about God. And so what we're going to see is kind of three things that God gives to his people, even in the midst of exile and brokenness. And these are the three things: protection, provision, and peace. And so those are the three things that are kind of form our outline as we work through the text. So let's start first by looking at God giving protection through deception. Protection through deception. So in verses 1-3 of our text, we read that there is a famine in the land. So Isaac's dwelling here, there's a famine. And so he seeks to move to somewhere else where he can sustain his family. And the text reads, it seems to read as if he's on his way to Egypt. God stops him and says, hey, don't go to Egypt. Instead, I want you to settle in Gerar. And so Isaac listens to God, and he settles as an immigrant in Gerar with King Abimelech and the Philistines. Now, you might remember that Isaac's father Abraham also had interactions with King Abimelech and the Philistines earlier in the text. Was this the same Abimelech? Scholars differ on it. He would have had to be pretty old if it was. But the word Abimelech simply means my father is king. And so many people think this could be just a title, or it's not uncommon even in today's culture to name your son after the father, especially when they're a ruling person. And so most likely this was a different king than the one that interacted with Abraham almost a century before. But if this is sounding familiar and creating a pattern, it should sound familiar. Like as you read through Genesis, if you feel like patterns and recurring themes are emerging, it is meant to make you stop and ponder and think. And it's also just really good storytelling. Like the authors of these books are genius in the way they tell this story. In many ways, the entire Abraham narrative is kind of summarized and collapsed into these couple chapters about Isaac. You have a barren wife, you have famine, you have deceit, you have strife over wells, you have covenants with enemies, like it's all there. And so it's kind of summarizing it for us. So Isaac settles in Gerar. He gets worried about his own life because he's worried the men will see the beauty of Rebekah and kill him. And so he conjures up the same plan that Abraham had years earlier and tells everyone, hey, not my wife, she's my sister. And so his ruse seems to be working until one day Abimelech sees Isaac caressing his wife. Now, many translations say playing with his wife. My favorite translation was the King James. It says he was sporting with her. So you can use that one if you want on your spouse. We don't know exactly what was going on, but clearly it was something you wouldn't do with your sister, right? Like it was clear that Abimelech saw it and was like, that's not a brother-sister relationship, right? So Abimelech calls Isaac on his lie Isaac makes an excuse, but again, we see a foreign king of a nation. Now, know that the original readers, even though the Philistines aren't like presented as bad guys yet in the story, when they're reading back into this narrative, the Israelite people would have thought Philistines equals really bad, violent people. They would have been known as an enemy. And here, a foreign king over this enemy people is used to be the mouthpiece of righteousness to God's people. And he's even used by God to bring about protection of Isaac and his wife Rebekah as they sojourn in Gerar. It says, if anyone harms Isaac or Rebekah, they would be put to death. This is similar language to God telling Cain, if anyone harms you, I will protect you. There's a lot in this section of the text that is intentionally cueing us back to the fall of mankind in the garden. You see deceit, you see protection after sin, and this story is serving to show us that the same sin is continuing from one generation to another. But what I love about this, it's also showing us that even in the midst of that continuing sin and deceit, God still acts and moves and protects Isaac from the effects of his sin. And this is good news, church. Even when temporary consequences take place because of our sin, for those that are God's, he promises to protect them through all kinds of chaos to ultimately bring them back into the garden, into God's presence, which is what Eden represents, and the abundance of provision that's available. And that's how our story continues. Again, it's intentionally moving us through the story we've seen so far. We've seen God's gift of protection through deception, and now we see God's gift of provision in destitution. We're told that even after he's given protection from this, so now he's not having to lie anymore, he settles there, and he even plants crops. And we're told in verse 12 that he reaps 100 times what he sows. That's like a crazy return on your investment, right? You finance gurus can figure that one out. It's a lot. The word for reaps here is not the normal word used for reaps. It's actually the normal word used for found. Like, it's just like he found crops. Like, they were just dropped in his lap. He just planted seed and voila, there they are. Like, it's making it clear that this is a gift. This isn't something that he earned. And so he gets these physical blessings, flocks, herds, all these things, which God is entitled to give. And he gets richer and richer and richer. And remember, this is in the middle of a famine, at least in the surrounding areas. And as a result of his blessing, those around him, the Philistines, get envious. We're hearkening again back to the early stories of Genesis when right after the fall, Cain gets envious of Abel and seeks to kill him. Now here the Philistines don't seek to kill him. They just want to kind of curb his success. And so they do it by start filling up the wells that his father had dug years prior. So he wouldn't have access to water. This was obviously a huge, water is important in any society, but wells are very important in this society. And so they're filling it up. In verses 17 through 21, we didn't read this, but Isaac leaves, and apparently he's still getting under their skin because they're kind of like following him and then claiming these wells for themselves. He lets them have one, and then he goes to another one, and he lets them have that one. It happens twice. He names those wells Esek and Sitnah, which means quarrel and strife. And so he's like, all right, I'm moving on. He names them. The names meant a lot in this culture. So he moves further away, apparently seems to just let them have what they want. And then he finds another well of water. And we're told in this one that they don't fight over it. Look at verse 22 of our text. It says, he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. He named it Rehoboth and said, for now the Lord has made space for us, and we will be fruitful in the land. God had continued to provide for Isaac, even as he's an immigrant and a sojourner. He's getting treated differently simply because of his perceived earthly success. I love this word, Rehoboth. It means open spaces or wide places, right? So it's not the crowded beach. It's like the wide open beach that you don't, like the wide open stadium, pick your seat in the shade or not. It doesn't matter. You get to pick. It's this idea of Isaac recognizing that God's supplies never run out. Man had shoved him further and further away, but in God's economy, there is never scarcity, even when it appears like it to human eyes. And that's really throughout all the verses 12 through 25, there is just this abundance of provision. The text makes it clear it is a gift from God. It's just poured out on Isaac's life. And the point of this is not to say that Isaac just had enough faith to get these physical blessings and that physical blessings are to always be expected for all of God's people. See, there is a bigger story going on. Again, the text is not trying to answer all of our questions. It's trying to answer what it wants to communicate. See, the way this is written, it is intentionally giving us cues that remind us of the garden. I've pointed a few out already, but here's what we're getting. In the midst of a famine, we are getting a little picture of a micro Eden in the midst of this. Isaac sowing seed in verse 12. It's the same word. We've not seen it used since Genesis 1 when God says, I'm giving to humans seed-bearing vegetation to provide for humanity. The multiple findings of waters just coming up out of the ground. It takes us back to the wasteland of Genesis 2 where nothing could grow, and then God made springs to come up out of the water to give life and cultivation. The language of God making space so they could be fruitful. It reminds us of God's commission to Adam and Eve, said, go be fruitful and multiply to this wide open space, spread my glory to the ends of the world. See, it's clear again that all of this blessing, all of this abundance was provided for Isaac and his family, not to hoard it, not primarily for the purpose of comfort, but for the purpose of service and to be a beautiful attraction to the world around them. And let me explain what I mean by this. Later, when the nation of Israel was given the laws of God's justice and said, here's what it looks like to live under a good rule and reign. This is the motivation for why they're given it. Look at Deuteronomy 4. It says, carefully follow them, all these laws of justice, for this will show your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the people. People are watching you. When they hear about all these statutes, they will say, this great nation is indeed a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God near to it, as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call to him? The idea here is that other nations would see this and that they would find their own ultimate blessing in coming underneath the good and gracious rule and reign of Yahweh. So in the middle of this destitute land, in the middle of this famine, here in Isaac's life, we're getting a micro glimpse of what it looks like when God is king. There is plenty of room and there is enough to go around. And it works. Look at verses 26 of our chapter. These people that were like really envious and filling up their joys, like you can't beat them, just join them. That's what happens. Look at what they say. They come to Isaac and they say, hey, we've clearly seen how the Lord has been with you. We think there should be an oath between two parties, between us and you. Let us make a covenant with you. You will not harm us, just as we have not harmed you, don't forget, but have done only what was good to you, sending you away in peace. You are now blessed by the Lord. And Isaac responds. He prepares a banquet for them. They eat and drink, get up early in the morning, swear an oath to each other. Isaac sends them on their way, and they leave him in peace. God gave protection through Isaac's deception. He gave provision in the midst of destitution, and here he gives peace for division. Even though Isaac and his family had been provided for, the reality is there was still the threat of outside armies. There was still the threat of outside enemies. The original readers, again, would have known the Philistines, how violent they would eventually become. But just like his father before him, he enters into a covenant with these people. They recognize and see God is with you. And there's a better story to be had. And I don't even really probably know how to communicate this, but there's something in me that wants a part of what you got. Isaac prepares a feast. We're not going to reiterate this. We've seen this before around different covenants already in the story of Genesis. And they eat and drink together and go in peace. In verses 32 through 33, we again see the language of Beersheba. We saw it in Abraham's story. It means well of the seven oaths. It's this idea of completeness. There is harmony. God had protected them through sin. He had provided for them in the midst of a famine, and now he's brought peace, and he has prepared a table for Isaac in the presence of his enemies. This is a beautiful picture of Eden. This word peace is this idea of shalom. There is peace, harmony, abundance. And through God's goodness, Isaac is seen as the shepherd that's ensuring it all. He's leading flocks, he's leading people, he's leading civilizations. But I want you to look how the chapter ends. It says, when Esau, which is Isaac's son, was 40 years old, he took as his wives Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. They made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. So we've gotten a glimpse into Eden, but sin still lurks at the door. Isaac is at peace with his enemies, yet he's still warring with his own kids. And the scriptures don't hide from this. Even though we get glimpses of eternity, we get micro pictures of Eden, the reality is, if we live long enough and we're honest enough, we know we're still not home. Something is not right. There is a tension that exists. At the end of the day, we're still exiles, roamers, nomads, and we are in need of a better shepherd who can provide what we need. The nation of Israel would later understand this as they grow into a nation and they're told once again, just like Isaac, hey, you're too powerful for us when they were in Egypt. But instead of being sent away, they're actually enslaved. They were oppressed as foreigners and immigrants because of the scarcity mindset of the Egyptians. If there's too many of them, there's not enough room for us. So we're going to enslave you and just use you for our purposes. But God was faithful. He delivered them. He brought them out. And one thing, if you notice, that God warned Israel of often is don't become what you hate. He did not want them to think that they delivered themselves, that anything they had was of their own doing. It was all a gift. And so you should not be hanging on to this or hoard it. It's why there's multiple calls in the scriptures. Don't oppress the immigrant or the foreigner among you. Don't forget that's who you once were. And we all know what it's like to be the outsider, the one who doesn't get the inside jokes, the one who doesn't understand what we're supposed to be doing and when we're supposed to stand and where we're supposed to sit. And it's okay when you're just like in a church service, but when it's like actually affecting your livelihood, it's a big deal. God also established regular rhythms of Sabbath. Israel was literally like commanded not to work. Like, we're going to force you to take a vacation. Every 7 years, take a year off. Imagine a job giving you that package. But the point of all this was to actively work against the scarcity mindset. When you are forced to rely on God as the ultimate provider, then you can't live in that way. To remind us that God will give us everything we need when we need it. But eventually and unfortunately, Israel succumbs to the temptation of sin and the attraction of false idols, and they become what they hate. The prophets record Israel's repeated failures. I don't want to hear your empty worship when you're oppressing and ignoring the immigrant and the poor around you. I don't want to hear it. You're going through the motions. Let's see lives that actually live out what you say you believe. And the harshest words were reserved for Israel's leaders. Look at Ezekiel 34. You can go read this whole chapter. It's pretty blunt. Here's a few verses. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the Lord God says to the shepherds. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who have been feeding themselves. Shouldn't the shepherds feed their flock? You eat the fat, you wear the wool, you butcher the fattened animals, but you do not tend the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, healed the sick, bandaged the injured, brought back the strays, or sought the lost. Instead, you have ruled them with violence and cruelty. And the chapter goes on with the scathing rebuke of Israel's leaders. Those shepherds that were meant to provide provision and healing and rescue had only taken advantage, ignored, and allowed them to be scattered. But if you read the whole chapter of Ezekiel 34, the good news is God says, you know what? I'll do it. I'm going to go to the ends of the earth, and I'm going to find all these scattered sheep. And I'm going to bring them into a place of protection and provision and peace. And you see similar language to our text today where there's plenty of space and there's water that's flowing. See, ultimately, there is no human shepherd that can be what we need. So Yahweh steps in and does it himself. And that is where we find our ultimate protection, provision, and peace. It's not in a return on our investment. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. I have what I need. He lets me lie down in green pastures. Imagine this with me. He leads me beside quiet waters. He renews my life. He leads me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even when I go through the darkest valley, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord, eat in imagery, as long as I live. You see all these beautiful pictures of protection, provision, and peace summed up here in this beautiful psalm. Isaac roamed in wide open pastures. His life was renewed. He was eventually given no reason to fear danger, and he feasted in the presence of his enemies. And that was all a gift to point us to the one true shepherd, Jesus. It is no accident that the angels came to shepherds watching over their flock diligently at night. The nobodies often in this society getting the night shift. And they're announced the birth of the Messiah. And they get to go see this baby boy. And it is setting up this theme of Jesus as shepherd from the moment of his birth. He explicitly calls himself the true shepherd. And he says, I'm gonna lay down my life for the sheep. The shepherd will become the lamb. And unlike Israel's shepherds who lay down the sheep's lives for themselves, he will invert this. He provides an abundance of bread. This is provision as he miraculously feeds over 5,000 people. And then he turns around and says, I am the true bread of life. He meets the woman at the well and says, I'm the living water. Drink of me and you'll never thirst again. Not even the most powerful enemies can take this water from us once we drink of it. He had no problem sharing his father's provision with all. I love, he says, hey, in my father's house, there are many rooms. You think there ain't room for you in this kingdom? You think you ain't good enough? You think you ain't smart enough? It's only reserved for the best and the brightest? I got plenty of room, and I'm going to get them ready for all my followers. He feasted around tables regularly, and he's like bringing all these people that should not be at the same table together, sitting at the same table. Nations, social classes here together. And it like leads him up to the ultimate feast when he sits in the upper room and he establishes the covenant communion with his body and blood. And he does it in the presence of his own enemy, Judas, his betrayer. But he still washes Judas's feet, shepherding and serving to the very end. He says, this is love. Love your enemies. In Matthew 26, he makes it clear. He says, I'm the shepherd who would be struck, and that all the sheep would be scattered. And he's referring to his death and the fleeing of his disciples. But he is willing to go because unlike Isaac, he doesn't have any fear of death. He says, no one's taking my life. I'm laying it down. He'll put himself in harm's way instead of throwing his bride out of fear of death. As the great shepherd, he'll lay down his life for the sheep instead of using them for his own purposes. And that's why he goes to the cross to wage war on sin and death and the enemy, and he will protect his sheep through it. On the cross, he becomes the lamb slain for deceitful sinners to redeem the world and make all things new. He becomes sin for us who knew no sin, that we might become his righteousness. He is both just and somehow he justifies the ungodly. And sin and enemy will not have the last word. Because again, he made it clear, no one takes my life. I willingly lay it down, and guess what? You can be dang sure I'm gonna take it back up again. And that's what he does. By the power of the Spirit on the third day, he rises from the tomb and he causes a river of life and abundance to flow from his being. That's why we see a river of life flowing from the throne in Revelation. Everything we need, all protection, provision, and peace is found through the life, death, burial, and resurrection of this shepherd king. And he ascends back to his father's hand, but he's like, hey, I'm gonna be back. Like, hang on, I'm gonna be back to finish the work. I'm gonna go prepare a place. I'm getting it ready. It's gonna be better than anything you could dream. And just as sure as he got back up out of the grave, he will return to take us to be with him forever. And he will go to the ends of the earth and he will find his lost sheep and he will pick us up from the depths of our despair. He will put us on his shoulders and he will carry us to a place of final rest and joy. This is something we could never do for ourselves. And in him, we find these promised green pastures, abundant and free. Go read of it. Death and sin will be no more. There will be no more tension or division. There will be no more strife and contention. No one will go hungry. There will be plenty. No one will feel like an outsider. The gates of the city, we're told, will be left open. You know what that means? There ain't no danger. Just leave the front door open. There's nothing to be scared of. Death and sin has been defeated. It's been cast outside the kingdom forever. This is the vision that we get this small micro foretaste of in Genesis 26. And we get to see consummated in the work of Christ. And here's the invitation. All who just simply by faith, Isaac didn't do anything to get all of that. Nothing. He didn't deserve it. Read his story. But by faith, those who accept and believe in Christ and his work are invited into this story. And that's what we get to look forward to. And in a sense, this is what we have right now. But if we're honest, like Isaac, like we know that strife and contention still exist. Some of you are living it. Injustice still moves on. Deception still tempts us. And that is why the Apostle Peter chooses the language of exiles to describe the church. Because we live in this already not yet. It is completed. It was finished on the cross, and we're waiting for the consummation and the full experience of that. And so here we are not fully home, but we can know that he will keep us through sin. He will protect us. He will complete the work he started in you. We know that he will give us everything we need, that he will provide for his people. It does not mean a promise of endless comfort. Go read the New Testament. Suffering is promised, not endless comfort. But God has promised to provide, to teach us how to be content in both highs and lows, in plenty and in want, in joys and sorrows, because we have everything we need in Christ. And he brings ultimate peace. Somehow, I don't get it. He unites enemies and strangers. Like sometimes in my missional community, I'm like, y'all don't belong in the same room together. Like this, y'all should be fighting over these political positions. And somehow you're not, like you're laughing about them. The world says you can't do that. But this is what the gospel does. And so as the church, here's what happens. We hope to, and we will not do this perfectly, but here's the call to you as this local expression of God's universal church, to become that beacon of hope in a dark world. To become this place of protection, provision, and peace where people can actually experience that tangibly in the here and now. When we really believe that we've received all riches in Christ, and like Isaac, it's not to hoard it, but rather to share it, to be this beautiful picture to the world of where real treasure is found. When we believe that, we actually live with open hands. We don't live with the scarcity mindset, just fighting for every little thing. The church should be a space of wide open places where we live in complete trust. God's gonna give us everything we need so we don't have to hold on to what we have. We can send others to take this good news to the edges of the earth to find lost sheep. And we also don't have to be afraid of others coming in and taking our stuff. We know that God is the giver of all good gifts. There's plenty to go around. It's true. Like, so we can begin to welcome others like Christ has welcomed us. Like the church should be the most welcoming place on the planet. And here's the thing, as we go into like election season, political positions will come and go. But the way we treat the foreigner and the outsider and the immigrant among us will always reflect what we really believe about Christ's work. So may we engage with love and compassion. The way we treat people, especially those who have nothing to give us in return, reveals a lot about our hearts. Because when we recognize we were the ones who had nothing to give in return, we were the outsiders of God's kingdom, and somehow we were graciously welcomed in, we say, how would we withhold anything from others? The people of God should be actively fighting against injustice and oppression. We should create a space of safety and belonging. And it looks a lot different depending on your personality and who you are in your spaces. But we're binding up the wounds. We're seeking the lost. We're chasing the hurting. As members of Christ's body, we work to provide for and protect each other. And here's the thing. To do this, we're completely dependent on the Spirit of God that raised Jesus from the dead. This stuff is not normal. The things you're called to as a Christian, good luck doing them on your own. We can't do any of this without radical dependence on the Spirit of God. That's why each week as we come to the table, to this feast, we remember the grace that we were given to even be invited to this table. And so we welcome others. We remember the sacrifice of the Good Shepherd, his body and blood that was given for us. And so we work to create spaces of healing and abundance for wounded sheep. And this is all not saying, hey, so you give us credit. Man, we're just a really cool place. It's a really awesome church. New Eden could come and go. The moment we stop displaying to the world the goodness of Jesus, take us out. And I say that with fear and trembling, but I mean it. Because at the end of the day, we're pointing to the Good Shepherd King who's going to return to put all things right and make all things new. Until the day the new creation floods with shouts of people from every tribe, every nation, every tongue, singing, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive glory and honor and power and riches. We will roam free. We will be fully cared for. We will be fully united to the Father and each other. And there won't be any more tension of this already not yet nature of this age, because we will finally be home. And that is good news. Let's pray.